Okay, good evening, class. Today we're going to talk about World War II and do a little follow up from the session we had this evening. And I want to talk a little bit about basically just how the course of World War II kind of unfolded here in a few minutes. So this is going to be very, very quick and precise, but I just want y'all to understand how World War II kind of unfolded a little bit. So first, um, World War II will start when Hitler will invade Poland. Now, if you remember, we talked about the concept of appeasement, how in the run up of World War II in the late 1930s, France and Britain had simply allowed Hitler and the Germans to grab Austria and the Sudetenland, which was a German-speaking area of Czechoslovakia, and the Italians have been able to grab a little nation called Albania, and they have been able to annex and grab Ethiopia into a colonial state. And the the two dictators realized that the Western powers weren't going to do anything because there was a fear among the French and the British that if they tried to confront Hitler, it would just simply lead into another war. And the British and French are trying to avoid a new war by any means necessary, and in this case, appeasing the Germans. And so Hitler basically rolled into Poland thinking that the Western powers were fairly weak, and Poland was a fairly soft target. Now, let's talk a little bit about why Hitler did that. Hitler had this concept called Lebensraum. It's a German word. It means living space. And the Germans wanted to kind of expand the German Empire into new lands and move in German settlers and German farmers and simply expand the areas held by German speaking people. And Poland was going to be the first step in this grand plan. And eventually, in a perfect world, the Nazis wanted to expand this German empire all the way to potentially the Ural Mountain and the Volga River. So that was kind of the plan of the Nazis. It's very similar to something the Japanese had in mind in Asia, which was expanding the Japanese nation into Manchuria and possibly parts of China. Now, a word that's often used to refer to the Germans and to Nazi Germany is the Third Reich. The Third Reich comes from the idea that this was the third German empire, Reich, reign in German or empire, that this is going to be the third German empire. And the first German empire was the Holy Roman Empire that was started in the Middle Ages. It wasn't the Roman Empire that you think of today, it was a medieval organization. Don't have time to go into it. The Second Reich was the unified Germany that was started in the 1870s after the first German French War, the Franco German War, Franco Prussian War, and Prussia being an old name for the biggest part of Germany, Prussia, Germany. And that created the Second Reich, and now Hitler was creating the Third Reich. And so this Third Reich was going to expand all the way throughout Poland, possibly into Russia. And that that was kind of Hitler's overall goal. And so when France was defeated and Hitler had control of most of Europe and Britain was kind of on the ropes, he invaded Russia in order to gain resources and also to try to expand the German nation and grab land that German settlers could be settled on. Now, The group of people who live in Eastern Europe are referred to as Slavs. It's an ethnic group. And Hitler saw the Slavs as lesser human beings. And at some point, they would be enslaved and eventually worked to death. And as they were eliminated, Germans would be moved into the area. Okay, so now Hitler in 1940, 41, 42 has taken over all of Europe, including France, Norway. All of Southern Europe is now under his control, and he has pushed deep into Russia within a few miles of Moscow. And he is now battling the Russians in a city called Stalingrad. And as we talked about in class, in Europe, that is the turning point of the war. Now, at this point, the United States has had a very, very limited role in the European theater of World War II. The main role we are facing is being the arsenal of democracy. We are supplying the Allied nations with large amounts of war material. Ironically, one of the things that the Soviet Union wanted and needed more than anything else wasn't guns or planes. It was simply large transport trucks. Joseph Stalin, when he made his request through the Lend-Lease Act, this act of lending weapons, he made a massive request for simply large trucks. The army referred to them as deuce and a halves. And so you have this really interesting phenomenon of Soviet soldiers going into battle on the back of American-made 2.5-ton trucks. And that was one of the main things that Joseph Stalin wanted, ironically, of all things. And so that is now the role of the United States. The first time the United States goes into actual combat against the Germans, it's going to be in North Africa. Now, Joseph Stalin was wanting the Allies to open up what was called a second front. The Soviets were tied down with the Germans, and they were simply pounding each other, simply hitting each other, pounding. And what Stalin wanted was for his allies to attack the Germans somewhere else in Europe and force the Germans to move some of those soldiers away from where they were fighting the Russians so that they would fight the French, the British, the Americans, or whatever. And so the first time we go into combat is helping the British attack German and Italian forces, because remember, Italy is part of the Axis, in northern Africa. Now, northern Africa had been taken over by the Axis, and the Germans and the Italians wanted to take over Egypt, possibly get some of the oil of the Middle East, and cut the Suez Canal, which was a waterway that connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, which would then force the British to go all the way around Africa to India to gain supplies. Okay, so U.S. forces land in North Africa. And the first time they go up against the Germans, U.S. forces are beaten badly. It was called the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and it was a complete humiliation for the U.S. military. And at that point, Franklin Roosevelt, on the advice of military officials, brings in a new general in northern Africa named George S. Patton to whip the U.S. Army into shape, which he does. If you don't know anything about General Patton, he was a adult language using, hard fighting, hard swearing soldier who was kind of a no nonsense type of guy. And he whipped the U.S. Army into shape. And the next time we go against the Germans, it's going to be a completely different story. Now, once the Germans and Italians are removed from North Africa, the question then is, what should the British Americans do at this point to help out the Russians? Now, The war goes on, and the Russians are begging again for that second front. And Churchill, who's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, suggests that we attack the underside of Europe, what he refers to as the soft underbelly of Europe. And so the next target for the Allies is going to be Italy. Now, Italy. Italy was an ally of the Germans, but was a fairly weak ally. Mussolini entered World War II with an army that was really technologically behind the Germans and behind most European nations. And so the Allies go from North Africa to attacking the Italian island of Sicily. And then from Sicily, they go on to the main Italian peninsula, the boot of Italy, is some kind called. If you look at Italy, it looks like a high heel boot. All right. Now, at this point, the Russians are still not happy. There is no pressure by the Germans or for the Germans to move large numbers of German soldiers to attack us. We've attacked North Africa, we've attacked Italy, but yet neither of these moves has relieved the Russians. So finally, June 6, 1944, the Allies launch what's called Operation Overlord, which is the D-Day landings in northern France. Now, the war for the Russians has been going on since 1940-41, and now we don't get really involved in a real meaningful way for the Russians until 1944, when we attacked Normandy, France during Operation Overlord, which is D-Day. Now, let's talk about D-Day for a second. D-Day is the American, British, Canadian, and some French attacking an area of northern France called Normandy. The idea is very straightforward. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers will simply storm beaches. Now, if you think about going to the beach, that's a wide open place. And this has the potential of being an absolute disaster in every way possible. If the Germans are well prepared for us landing in Normandy, it's going to be a bloodbath. And in Omaha Beach, which was one of the beaches that we landed on, and all the beaches had a code name: Omaha, Utah, Soul, Sword, Gold, Juno beaches. And U.S. soldiers landed in Omaha Beach, and that was the one beach where the Germans were really prepared and had really competent soldiers, and it turned into a bloodbath. The British and Canadians landing at 3 other beaches had an easier time. But Omaha Beach was an absolute bloodbath for the U.S. military. We lost thousands and thousands of soldiers. It was an open beach, charging into machine gun fire, and the Germans were really waiting for us. But so many soldiers get thrown onto the beaches that they eventually overwhelmed the German defenders, and we were able to push into northern France. Now, as soon as that invasion is done, we then invade southern France. And so now the Germans are facing this. We've invaded in northern France, in southern France. We're pushing up into Italy, and the Russians are pushing from the east. And now the Germans are completely overstretched. And at this point, it's only a matter of time. Right now, the Germans are caught in a squeeze play. The Russians are pushing from the east, and we're pushing from three directions in the west: Italy, southern France, northern France. And the Germans just are too spread out. As this is going on, there is a strategic bombing campaign, and it's really simple. We're going to bomb Germany into dust. And it's as simple as that. We are going to bomb every city, every factory, anything that could possibly help the Germans has got to go. And in many cases, we're bombing entire cities, residential areas. In one case, we bombed a city that had no military importance, it was Dresden, Germany. And we bombed the U.S. military, the U.S. Army Air Corps was no Air Force, it was simply the Army Air Corps. Bombs Dresden at night. I mean, excuse me, in the day, and then the British come in and bomb at night. And this was simply a residential city with very little military significance. And so we are basically destroying Germany as we're squeezing them from multiple directions. And by 1945, it doesn't matter how valiantly the Germans are fighting at this point, it's done. Hitler has one last attempt to attack and push the Allies out of France. It's called the Battle of the Bulge. It fails spectacularly for the Germans. It's a great story. Read about it. And we simply push from the west. The Russians push from the east. And eventually, the Russians are able to roll into Berlin. And Hitler commits suicide. A good paper topic, if anybody cares to do it. Did Hitler make it out of Germany? There's speculation. There's some good evidence that supports it. I personally don't believe it. I think Hitler committed suicide, like the historical record says, and that was the end of him. So that is the course of the war in Europe. And now, if you want to move very quickly to the Pacific Ocean, the United States military looks at the Japanese Empire and realizes that this is going to be a tough nut to crack. The Japanese have this mentality that if you die fighting for the emperor and you die fighting for Japan, that somehow or another that's going to send your soul to some higher level of being. I'm not an expert on Japanese religion, but the emperor was considered a godlike figure, and dying in defense of Japan and the emperor was a noble, holy thing. And so you're dealing with an entire nation that will not surrender. And in many cases, when Japanese soldiers are surrounded or they're in a hopeless situation, they'll simply charge American positions yelling "Banzai," and they'll just commit suicide by running into soldiers with loaded guns. So this is a very, very tough situation to deal with. And so what we do in the Pacific is we simply take the islands that have the most Japanese soldiers on them and bypass those islands and just leave them to wither and take the less fortified islands. With that being said, hundreds of thousands of U.S. Marines are being killed in the Pacific Ocean, taking islands that are not the most fortified ones that the Japanese have. And so, as we push closer to Japan, doing this island hopping strategy, the more fatalities we have. Now, at this point, President Roosevelt in 1945 dies, and President Truman, his vice president at the time and now president, has a decision. Enormous destructive power. And it can take out an entire city. And do you want to use it? Now, as Vice President of the United States, Harry Truman, the new president now since FDR dies in office, had not been informed of this new device. And he has to make a decision. And the atomic bomb was initially created to use against the Germans, but the Germans have surrendered. And so the idea of using it on Japan becomes extremely it seems like a good way to possibly make the Japanese quit, because by 1944-45 the Japanese have resorted to suicide air attacks, kamikazes, taking a plane, loading it with bombs and fuel, and just plowing it right into U.S. ships. The Japanese are not going to quit fighting. They're not going to surrender. And so Harry Truman sees the atomic bomb as a way to end the war and save American lives. And he makes a comment, save even Japanese lives by destroying a city with one bomb and showing the Japanese how useless the fighting is going to be. Okay, so 2 atomic bombs are dropped on Japan, and the Japanese surrender. And so that's pretty much the course of World War II. Okay. And we'll do another video dealing with the Holocaust in Israel. I think it's very important. So I will see y'all next time.